All right, welcome back for another deep dive. This time you've sent us towards, well, what some might consider a marketing Bible.
Yeah, a classic.
The 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing by Ries and Jack Trout.
And these laws, they really are designed to cut through, I think, a lot of the noise and the myths, and sometimes, frankly, just bad thinking around marketing.
Yeah, and we're going to be diving deep into these laws, looking at examples, stories. We'll even share some of our own personal experiences that relate to these principles.
And I think what's really fascinating about these laws is how they've stood the test of time. This book was written a while ago, but these principles, they're still incredibly relevant in today's fast-paced marketing world.
Yeah, absolutely. So in this deep dive, what we're going to try to do is, I think, give you a framework, a new lens through which to view marketing. We're going to be unpacking some of the core concepts, like the importance of being first, where perception really often trumps reality. We're going to delve into the surprising strength that comes from focus, why trying to be everything to everyone can really be a recipe for disaster. And we'll also explore the importance of understanding where you stand in the competitive landscape.
And it's interesting because Ries and Trout, they really don't hold back. They use examples of some really big companies, giants really, that have stumbled by ignoring these laws. We're talking about companies like IBM, General Motors, Sears.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to see how, even with all the resources in the world, sometimes these companies made really fundamental marketing mistakes.
Exactly. Ries and Trout, they come from a very strong background in analyzing marketing success and failures. They're particularly known for their work on positioning, which is all about how you place your brand in the mind of the customer. And they even draw on a kind of a military model of the marketplace, thinking strategically about competition.
It's a great way to put it. It's not just sort of armchair theorizing. It's really based on seeing what works and what doesn't.
Absolutely. And the core idea, the thread that runs through everything is this. There are 22 immutable laws of marketing. You can try to ignore them, but you do so at your own risk. Understanding these laws gives you, I think, a real competitive advantage.
So let's jump into our first law, the law of leadership.
All right.
This law states that it's better to be first than it is to be better. Now, this might sound a bit counterintuitive at first. We're often told that the best product or service ultimately wins out.
Right.
But Ries and Trout argue that getting into the prospect's mind first, that carries a unique and, I think, often insurmountable advantage.
It does seem strange at first, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, our natural inclination is to want to be, to strive for superiority, to be the best. But think about it from the customer's perspective, you know? Who do you remember as the pioneer in a particular field?
Right.
Ries and Trout give this really great example. Charles Lindbergh, the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic. His name, it's etched in history, right?
Yes, sure.
Now, Burt Hinkler, he was the second person to do it. And by many accounts, a more skilled pilot with a better plane.
Yeah.
And yet, he's largely forgotten. And so, what does that tell you about how we remember and we prioritize first?
It's a powerful example. And I think it plays out in so many different areas of life. Think about the first brand that comes to your mind when you think of certain categories, right?
Yeah.
Like rent-a-cars, Hertz. What about computers?
IBM?
Cola.
Coke.
Imported beer. It's interesting, even decades later, it still dominates often when people think about imported beer, even though there are countless other options. Some might even be considered better in terms of taste or quality, right?
It's that first association, yeah.
Yeah. What first come to mind for you in categories that you're familiar with, and why do you think those brands still hold that top spot in your mind?
Well, you mentioned imported beer, and I think it's fascinating how Miller Lite, for instance, was the first domestic light beer.
Right.
And even though, the market is just flooded with light beers now, it remains a powerhouse, And it's not about who brews the best light beer according to some objective criteria.
Right.
It's about who established that presence in our minds first.
Yeah. But now it's important to acknowledge that, simply being first doesn't guarantee success.
Right. Yeah.
Ries and Trout, they point to USA Today as an example, the first truly national newspaper in the U.S.
Right.
Ahead of the curve in many ways, but they also faced financial struggles and lost a lot of money initially.
Right.
So sometimes being first can also be too early. The market's not quite ready for it.
Yeah.
Can you think of any other examples where being first wasn't enough?
Yeah, I think sometimes the first idea itself is just not viable.
Mm-hmm.
They mentioned Frosty Paws, the first ice cream specifically marketed for dogs.
Right.
I mean, your dog might love it, but, the person holding the wallet, the dog owner, they might not see it as a necessary purchase.
Yeah.
So even with that first mover advantage, a fundamentally flawed idea is not going to gain traction.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And Ries and Trout, they also connect being first to being the leading brand, right?
Right.
So think about like Harvard University, the oldest college in America.
Yeah.
It's not just the first. It's widely regarded as a leading university, right?
Right.
And I think that there's often this perception that the first is also the best or the most significant. Why do you think we tend to equate those two things?
Well, I think there's something to be said about that initial imprint. Our brains, they kind of anchor on that first piece of information that we receive.
Yeah.
And so, people develop a loyalty or familiarity with what they encounter first. And even if something comes along that's slightly improved, there's just this inertia of the established brand. It's kind of like even with twins, people often, feel a stronger connection to the one they met first.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we see this across so many different categories, right?
Yeah.
Think about magazines, Time magazine. It was the first weekly news magazine. And it still kind of leaves when people think of that category, even against strong competitors like Newsweek.
Right.
And it's true for both sort of those softer categories like colleges or universities, but also, more tangible things like cars, computers.
Yeah.
I mean, Jeep, the four-wheel drive category, Acura, luxury Japanese cars, IBM and mainframes, Sun and workstations.
All leaders.
All leaders, and they were all first.
And all first, yeah.
But what about Chrysler with the minivan?
Yeah.
I mean, they got there first, and they've maintained a pretty strong presence ever since, right?
I think so, yeah.
What other categories can you think of where the first entrant still kind of holds that dominant position?
Well, what's really fascinating is how those pioneering brands, they can sometimes become, synonymous with the entire product category.
Right.
Think about Scotch tape.
Yeah.
Band-Aids, FedEx.
Yeah.
People, they use the brand name to refer to the product itself, regardless of who actually made it.
Right.
It's the ultimate level of market leadership, isn't it?
Totally. And they bring up Tylenol, right?
Yeah.
It was the first acetaminophen pain reliever.
Right.
And it became so dominant, it's almost hard to even name a competitor to Tylenol.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
And then they shift the focus to how many companies really get caught up in this idea of having a better product, constantly benchmarking against the competition.
Right.
Why do you think that mentality, this better product mentality, is so ingrained in business thinking?
I think it's natural, it's logical.
It is.
We assume that if we can offer something superior, if we can just make it a bit better, customers they'll flock to it.
Right. It seems like it should work that way.
It should. And while, quality is super important, of course, but Ries and Trout really argue that, in the realm of marketing, perception often trumps objective reality.
Yeah.
Customers often perceive that first product they become aware of as being the standard.
Right.
Even if subsequent products might have better features or specs, it's all about how it's perceived. And so marketing, in essence, becomes this battle for those perceptions.
Yeah, it really does. And they even pose some, I think, thought-provoking questions to illustrate this, right?
Right.
What was the first brand of aspirin that entered the market? What about the first acetaminophen pain reliever, ibuprofen? And the point is that often the first one to establish itself in our minds as the solution to a need, that becomes the benchmark, that becomes the leader that we think of. And Charles Schwab is another example of being the first discount broker.
Yeah.
Really creating a new category. And this led them to become a major player.
You did, yeah.
And then just to really drive home the point of being first, they kind of do this rapid fire round of historical achievements, right?
Yeah.
Neil Armstrong, Roger Bannister, George Washington, Thomas's English Muffins, Gatorade. I mean, we readily recall those first, but who remembers the second?
Exactly.
They often fade into obscurity.
Mm-hmm.
And it just really underscores the power of capturing that initial mind share.
It does.
Okay, so let's move on to our second law, the law of the category.
Right.
This law suggests that if you can't be first in a category, you should try to set up a new category you can be first in.
Right.
So if you're coming into a market and you feel like, oh, I've missed the boat, I'm not going to be the absolute pioneer.
Right.
It's not over. The strategic move is to identify a fresh angle, a new segment where you can be that original.
And I think this is a really encouraging law, especially, for businesses that weren't the initial market entrant.
Yeah.
To use a great example with Amelia Earhart. She wasn't the third person to fly solo across the Atlantic.
Right.
That would have been a pretty minor footnote in history.
Yeah.
But she is celebrated, as the first woman to accomplish that feat.
Yeah.
And so she essentially defined a new category of Atlantic solo flyers, right?
Right.
So can you think of other examples, maybe even in your own life or in the news, where someone gained recognition by being the first within a specific niche?
Yeah, that's a great way to frame it. And Ries and Trout, they give this really good business illustration with Anheuser-Busch after Heineken had found success in the U.S. market with imported beer.
Right.
Instead of trying to introduce another imported beer.
Right.
To compete head on, they asked a really smart question. If there's a market for a high-priced imported beer, perhaps there's a market for a high-priced domestic beer. And that led to the creation of Michelob.
Yeah.
The first in that new category, and it actually ended up outselling Heineken.
Wow.
And they contrast this with Carlsberg, another imported beer that tried to enter the U.S. market around the same time. But as a Me Too brand, just another imported beer, it never gained significant traction.
Right.
What does that tell you about the power of differentiation through categorization?
It really does highlight the advantage of identifying an unmet need or a slightly different angle within that existing market, right? We talked about Miller Lite, the first domestic light beer.
Right.
Well, following that success, an importer recognized the potential for an imported light beer, and so Amstel Light became, quite successful by being the first to fill that specific niche.
Yeah.
So it's about seeing the market not just as this big monolithic entity, but as a collection of potential categories.
Yeah. And this strategy is really evident in the early days of the computer industry, right?
Yeah.
After IBM had really established its dominance, instead of all these companies just trying to compete as just another computer company, many found success by carving out and leading these new categories.
Right.
So like Digital Equipment Corporation.
Right, yeah.
DEC. They became a major player by being the first to really market mini computers.
Yeah.
What other examples from the tech world can you think of that really illustrate this idea of succeeding by creating new categories?
Oh, absolutely. Think about Tandem with fault-tolerant computers. They were the first to really focus on that critical need. And then Stratus came along with fault-tolerant mini computers.
Right.
So further segmenting that market.
Yeah.
Cray, they pioneered the supercomputer category. Convex created this mini supercomputer niche, and even Commodore Amiga, with its focus on multimedia capabilities, it essentially created this multimedia computer category. And then you think about Dell, they really disrupted that traditional retail model by being the first to really successfully sell computers directly to consumers over the phone.
Yeah.
So all of these companies thrived by defining and then leading these new distinct categories.
And it really shifts the way you think when you're launching something new,
That's
right?
nuts.
The question isn't how is this better than what's already out there,
right,
but rather first what?
That's it. First what? Yeah.
What new category are we pioneering?
Exactly.
What unique need are we fulfilling?
And that's really the core of this law, right? Charles Schwab wasn't just a better brokerage firm. It was the first discount broker catering to a whole different segment of investors.
Right.
Lear's magazine, wasn't the first magazine aimed at women, but it was the first magazine specifically for mature women addressing a previously underserved audience.
Wow.
So it's a fundamental shift from a brand-centric way of thinking to a category-centric one. Potential customers might be skeptical of brand claims, but they are generally much more open and interested in exploring entirely new categories.
Okay, so our third law takes us even, I think, deeper into the realm of the mind, right?
Yeah.
This is the law of the mind.
Right.
This law states that it's better to be first in the mind than first in the marketplace.
Right.
And this really builds on that first law, highlighting that being the first to actually launch a product or service, that's only truly valuable if it allows you to capture that position in the customer's thoughts, right?
Right. It's where the practical application of that first mover advantage really comes into focus.
Yeah.
It's not enough to be first in the market.
Right.
You have to be first in the mind, you know.
Not in mind. Yeah.
So to be the first brand that pops into a customer's head when they think of that particular need or category.
Right.
You know, Ries and Trout, they use that classic example of IBM.
Right.
And Remington Rand's UNIVAC. Now, UNIVAC, they were actually the first mainframe computer commercially available,
Right.
predating IBM's, significant entry.
Yeah.
But through this massive marketing effort, IBM, they secured that first position in the public consciousness as the leader in computers.
Yeah.
And ultimately, they dominated the early computer market.
Yeah. What does that tell you about the importance of perception over pure technical primacy?
I mean, it really, I think, underscores that marketing is fundamentally a battle for mind share. And that's something we'll talk about even further in the next law. But it's that, the customer's mind is the primary battleground, you know, and so many entrepreneurs and companies, they stumble here, you know. Yeah. They might have a genuinely innovative idea. They might be, first to launch, but they fail to effectively plant that seed in the prospect's mind.
Yeah.
And to establish themselves as that leader in that mental landscape.
Why do you think some early entrants fail to really capture that crucial mind share?
A lot of times it comes down to a lack of clear and consistent messaging.
Right.
Insufficient marketing investment. Yeah. Or sometimes just not understanding how to really break through the clutter and resonate with potential customers.
Yeah.
And I think the conventional response to this, this kind of challenge is to throw money at it, right? To increase advertising spending, ramp up PR efforts.
Yeah.
But as Ries and Trout wisely point out, more money is wasted in marketing than in almost any other business function.
Yeah.
Money alone is not a magic bullet for getting into the mind first.
Right. And once a perception is formed in someone's mind, it's incredibly difficult to change.
It is. Yeah.
I mean, Ries and Trout, they even draw parallels to historical military blunders.
Yeah.
The charge of the Light Brigade, Pickett's charge, highlighting this futility of attacking a strongly entrenched position head on.
Right.
They even bring up Wang Laboratories.
Yeah.
Who were pioneers in dedicated word processors, but they couldn't really make that leap in the public's mind to being a computer company.
Right.
And Xerox, right?
Yeah.
First in copiers. But similarly, they struggled to gain significant traction in the computer market.
Yeah.
Even though they had the resources, even some technological advantages.
Yeah.
Why do you think it's so hard to change someone's established perception of a company or a brand?
Well, I think, our minds tend to resist change.
Yeah.
And once we form an opinion or an association, it becomes this sort of mental shortcut.
Yeah.
And overwriting that existing association requires a significant and often disruptive force.
Yeah.
That's why those overnight sensations, they're not really sudden.
Right.
Often there's been, this buildup of awareness and a clear message that finally breaks through.
Yeah.
And, a strong opinion can form quite rapidly. If you want to make a significant impact and become first in the mind, you often need to, blast your way in with a really clear and compelling message, because people are they're naturally resistant to gradually altering their established views.
Right. And they also kind of revisit the role of money in this context, right?
Mm.
That sometimes a relatively small amount of money, if it's deployed strategically, at the right time, when the mind is still open and receptive, it can achieve remarkable results.
Yeah.
Think about the initial funding that it helped Apple get off the ground.
Right.
But then later on, even vast sums of money can't necessarily revive a company that's lost its prime position in that mental landscape.
Sure.
And then, having a simple, easy to remember name,
right,
like Apple, versus some of its more technically descriptive competitors, that certainly plays a role.
It does.
In facilitating that initial mind penetration.
Yeah.
What are some brands with particularly memorable names that you think really benefited from that simplicity in establishing themselves?
Well, I think brands like Kodak, Google, even Amazon, their names are easy to recall. They don't carry these pre-existing complex associations. And that likely, helped them establish their own strong meaning in the market.
Yeah, it's really about creating that immediate and clear mental connection.
Exactly.
So this leads us to our fourth law, and this is a real cornerstone of Ries and Trout's thinking, I think.
Yeah.
It's the law of perception.
Okay.
This law states that marketing is not a battle of products. It's a battle of perceptions.
Right.
So this really emphasizes that how your product or brand is perceived by the customer, that's far more critical than its objective features, its specifications, even its inherent quality.
And this is a really truly fundamental shift in perspective for a lot of people in the business world.
Yeah, I think so.
We tend to believe in objective truth.
Right.
We believe that a superior product will, naturally win out. But, Ries and Trout, they argue that all truth in marketing is ultimately relative.
Right.
Relative to the individual customer's mind.
Yeah.
And so, when we believe very strongly that our product is better, that our competitors isn't, we're essentially saying that our perception of the market is more accurate than theirs.
Right.
And, in our own minds, truth and our perception of it become very, very deeply intertwined. Have you ever been absolutely convinced that your choice of a product was superior only to find that, others strongly disagreed?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that's the law of perception in action.
It really is.
Mm.
And as humans, I think we have this tendency to try and make sense of the world by projecting our own understanding onto it, right?
Right.
We find reality in external representations,
Yeah.
reviews, expert opinions, what our social circles believe. But Ries and Trout, they kind of turn this around.
Yeah.
They say the only reality we can be sure of in marketing is the reality of our own perceptions, and crucially, the perceptions of our potential customers. And so marketing becomes fundamentally about understanding and influencing those perceptions.
Right.
Why do you think we struggle so much to accept that our own perceptions might not be universally shared?
It's human nature,
It is, yeah.
I mean, we tend to assume that our view of the world is the correct one.
Right.
And it can be really hard to step outside of our own perspective and really understand how others might see things differently.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to our own creations or beliefs.
Right. And Ries and Trout, they contend that most marketing mistakes stem from this very assumption, right?
Right.
That
Yeah.
you're engaged in this battle of objective product superiority.
Right, yeah.
But the laws that they outline, they're based on this opposite premise that marketing success hinges on understanding and managing perceptions.
It does.
What many marketers consider the natural or the logical way to market, focusing on demonstrable product advantages, that's often the least effective approach.
It is, yeah.
And they even go so far as to suggest that what we often consider truth in marketing is just one perceived expert's opinion or the prevailing belief within a company.
Right.
And this is why marketers often gravitate towards presenting, facts,
Yeah.
data.
Right.
They believe in this objective reality.
Yeah.
And they assume that if they can just present the evidence, the truth will be self-evident and persuasive.
Yeah.
But as we talked about with the law of the mind, changing a prospect's existing perception, even with compelling facts, I mean, that's an incredibly difficult undertaking.
It is. It's very, very difficult.
Those perceptions, they often feel like universal truths to the individual holding them.
Right.
Think about the long-standing perceptions around Japanese cars, Honda, Toyota, Nissan. The competition is not solely about, the tangible aspects of the cars.
Yeah.
Fuel efficiency, the reliability ratings, the sticker price.
Right.
It's fundamentally about what people think about those brands
It is.
in comparison to domestic or other international automakers.
Right.
And marketing is constantly trying to shape and reinforce those perceptions.
Right.
And these perceptions can be incredibly resistant to change.
Yeah.
Even in the face of evolving realities.
Yeah.
A company that's primarily known for motorcycles, as Ries and Trout suggest, with the Harley Davidson example,
Yeah.
they would face a significant hurdle trying to sell cars,
I think so.
no matter how well engineered those cars might be.
Yeah.
Simply because of that ingrained perception of the brand, right?
Exactly.
What other examples can you think of where a strong existing perception even if it's not entirely accurate,
Yeah.
has really impacted a company's ability to move into a new market.
Well, imagine a luxury fashion brand
Yeah.
that tries to launch a line of budget-friendly clothing.
Right.
Consumers might struggle to reconcile that perception of high-end exclusivity with mass market affordability.
Right.
The brand's established image creates this sort of perceptual barrier.
Yeah, that makes sense. And they also use the example of Campbell's soup and Heinz soup,
Right.
dominant in different geographical markets,
Right.
to illustrate that that consumer preference often isn't about some universally superior taste,
Right.
but about these ingrained cultural perceptions and familiarity.
Yeah.
And the infamous New Coke fiasco. I mean, that's a perfect case study.
It is.
Blind taste tests actually favored New Coke over the original,
Right.
yet the market overwhelmingly rejected it.
Right.
And this really shows that in categories like soft drinks, marketing is profoundly about managing those perceptions, those emotional connections, not just about flavor profiles.
It is. It's fascinating. And
Yeah.
what makes navigating this whole thing even more complex is that customers, frequently make decisions based on secondhand perceptions. The everybody knows principle.
Right.